The sun rose over the endless rows of corn on the Jefferson family farm, painting the fields in gold and green, the air thick with the scent of dew and earth. For over a century, this land had been the heart of the Jefferson legacy, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. At the center of it all was Harold Jefferson, a man whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom had earned him the respect of everyone in the county. He wore his overalls like a badge of honor, his hands calloused from years of work, his eyes sharp and kind beneath the brim of his old gray cap. To the neighbors, he was just Harold, the farmer who always had time to help fix a tractor or share a story at the feed store. But few knew that Harold was also Dr. Harold Jefferson, the current director of the Federal Aviation Administration, a man whose signature could ground a fleet or open the skies to new technology. He kept that part of his life private, preferring the peace of the fields to the politics of Washington, but he never forgot the responsibility that came with his title. The farm was his sanctuary, a place where he could be himself, where the only deadlines were the changing seasons and the only politics were the weather. But one morning, the sound of heavy machinery reverberating through the fields shook the windows and sent flocks of birds flying into the sky, breaking the peace. Harold stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and stared in disbelief as bulldozers and graders rolled through the corn, carving a wide, straight path from the edge of the property toward the heart of his land. At the front of the convoy was a gleaming white SUV, its doors emblazoned with the logo of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Out stepped Margaret Langley, the HOA president, her heels sinking into the soft earth, her suit immaculate despite the dust. She was surrounded by a group of contractors, surveyors, and 2 police officers in uniform, their faces grimly determined. Harold put down his mug and walked out to meet them, his mind racing with questions as he took slow, steady steps. Margaret greeted him with a tight smile, her eyes cold and calculating. "Good morning, Mr. Jefferson. I'm afraid we have some business to discuss." She launched into a rehearsed speech about community development, shared resources, and the greater good, explaining that the HOA had voted to build a private airstrip for the exclusive use of Willow Creek residents. The only problem, she said, was that the most suitable land happened to run straight through the Jefferson farm. She insisted, waving a stack of papers. "We sent you notices, but you never responded. Therefore, we are moving forward in accordance with the HOA charter and with the approval of the county." Harold listened in silence, clenching his jaw and feeling a mix of rage and disbelief in his heartbeat. The sudden invasion of his land, the destruction of his crops, and the violation of everything that his family had built were the only things he had received. No such notices, calls, or visits. He attempted to reason with Margaret, describing the farm's history, the significance of the land, and the legal safeguards that ought to have prevented this. But she waved her hand off and said, "Progress can't wait for sentimentality," dismissing his worries. The first row of corn was crushed by a bulldozer as the contractors turned on their equipment, and the police officers crossed their arms. Harold stood his ground, refusing to move, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're making a mistake," he said, his eyes locked on Margaret's. "A big mistake." She laughed, a brittle sound, and turned away, confident that the law was on her side. However, Harold was not simply a farmer, and neither was this merely a field. Neighbors were drawn to the noise and spectacle at the property's edge as the sun rose higher. Some were Willow Creek residents, eager for promise of private runway. Others were old friends of the Jeffersons, their faces etched with worry and outrage. Harold's family arrived, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, forming a silent line of support behind him. The machines roared, the dust rose, and the battle for the Jefferson farm had begun. What Margaret and the HOA didn't know was that Harold had spent his life learning how to fight battles like this. Not with fists or fury, but with knowledge, patience, and the quiet power of the law. And as the first strip of asphalt was laid across his land, Harold made a decision. He would not allow them to take what previous generations had constructed. He would fight, not just for his family, but for every farmer, every neighbor, every person who had ever been told that progress was more important than people. And he would do it in a way that only the director of the FAA could, by reminding them that everyone owned the skies and the ground beneath them. The next days unfolded in a blur of noise, dust, and disbelief as the HOA's construction crews pressed forward, tearing through the Jefferson farm with a sense of entitlement that left Harold's neighbors shaking their heads in outrage. The airstrip's path cut a brutal scar through the cornfields, flattening rows that had been planted by hand, destroying irrigation lines, and leaving behind a wasteland of churned earth and broken stalks. Margaret Langley was everywhere, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the contractors and brushing off the pleas of Harold's family. "We're within our rights," she insisted to anyone who would listen, her voice sharp with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "The HOA's charter grants us eminent domain over shared resources, and the county approved the project." She ignored the growing crowd of onlookers, the local news van that had parked at the edge of the property, and the quiet fury in Harold's eyes. However, Harold was active. While the machines roared outside, he was on the phone, first with his attorney, then with the county clerk, and finally with his contacts at the FAA. He explained the situation in measured, precise terms, laying out the violations, the lack of proper notice, the environmental impact, and the utter disregard for federal aviation regulations. His voice was calm, but beneath it was a steel that few had ever seen. The private HOA's attempt to construct an airstrip without federal approval, environmental studies, or even basic safety protocols shocked the FAA's legal team right away. Harold dispatched a team of inspectors within hours, with absolute authority and impeccable credentials. Meanwhile, the local news picked up the story, broadcasting images of bulldozers plowing through the Jefferson farm, interviews with tearful family members, and sound bites from Margaret about progress and community benefit. The public's response was swift and vehement. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #SaveJeffersonFarm and #HOVereach trending nationwide. The governor's office, the FAA, and even the county commission all received letters requesting an immediate halt to the project. But Margaret remained defiant, convinced that her connections and the HOA's legal team would shield her from any consequences. She stated in a press conference that the future of Willow Creek depends on bold action at the edge of the runway, surrounded by officers in uniform and a few supporters. She called Harold an obstructionist and said that he put his own needs ahead of the needs of the community. But the tide was turning. The FAA inspectors arrived in force, their presence impossible to ignore. They shut down the construction site, citing a laundry list of violations: no environmental impact assessment, no airspace coordination, no public safety plan, and most damning of all, no federal permit. The contractors were ordered to cease work immediately, their equipment impounded as evidence. The inspectors were unmoved by Margaret's protest, which included waiving her paperwork and threatening legal action. "You can't build a runway without FAA approval," one of them explained, his tone polite but firm. "And you absolutely cannot do it on private property without permission from the owner." The news cameras captured every moment, broadcasting Margaret's humiliation live to an audience of millions. Harold's expression was one of relief and quiet triumph as he stood at the center of it all with his family and neighbors gathered around him. But he knew the fight was not over. The farm suffered enormous harm, losing acres of crops, destroying irrigation systems, and leaving scars on the land from the heavy machinery. The legal battle would be long and costly, and the wounds to the community would take years to heal. But Harold was undeterred. He called a meeting of his family and supporters, laying out a plan to rebuild the farm, restore the land, and hold the HOA accountable for every dollar of damage. He collaborated with his attorney to sue the HOA, the contractors, and the county, requesting compensation and an open apology. He reached out to local farmers, environmental groups, and civil rights organizations, building a coalition that would fight not just for Jeffersons, but for every family threatened by unchecked power. He remained the calm center of the storm throughout, unwavering in his resolve and faith in justice. As the sun set over the battered fields, Harold stood on his porch, his family beside him, and watched the last of the bulldozers roll away. Even though the battle for the Jefferson farm was far from over, the land felt hope for the first time in days. The weeks that followed were a test of endurance, patience, and the unyielding spirit that had defined the Jefferson family for generations, as Harold found himself at the center of a legal and media firestorm that stretched far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. The farm, once a place of quiet routine, became a crossroads for lawyers, journalists, activists, and government officials, all drawn by the spectacle of small-town HOA's brazen overreach and the quiet defiance of the man who stood in their way. Harold's days began before dawn, walking the battered fields with his children and grandchildren, assessing the damage and planning the long road to recovery. The green, tall corn was now a patchwork of broken stalks and muddy ruts. The irrigation ditches were clogged with debris, and the soil had been compacted by the weight of heavy machinery. But Harold refused to let despair take root. He accepted any and all requests for assistance, no matter how insignificant, and set up work crews from among his neighbors and farmers in the area. Together, they cleared the wreckage, repaired fences, and replanted what they could, their efforts a testament to the power of community in the face of adversity. The legal battle continued in the interim. Harold was accused of obstructing community development and inciting public unrest in countersuits filed by Margaret Langley and the attorneys for the HOA. They asserted that Harold's refusal to cooperate posed a threat to the future of the neighborhood, and that the charter of the HOA granted them broad authority over all land within Willow Creek's boundaries. However, Harold's legal team deconstructed these arguments with methodical precision, supported by the FAA's own attorneys and a growing army of pro bono experts. They provided records demonstrating that the Jefferson Farm was established nearly a century before the HOA, that proper notice had not been given, and that the county had obtained approval through deception and backroom deals. The FAA's involvement proved decisive. Harold's colleagues at the agency made it clear that the Willow Creek airstrip was illegal on every level, despite Harold's recusal from official decisions as director. Federal investigators uncovered a web of corruption and negligence, implicating county officials who had accepted campaign donations and favors from the HOA in exchange for fast-tracking the project. The story became national news with headlines like HOA's Runway to Nowhere and Farmer Fights Back and Wins. Civil rights groups joined the fray, pointing out the long history of black landowners being targeted by powerful interests, and environmental organizations highlighted the damage done to the local ecosystem. The pressure mounted on Margaret and the HOA, their once solid support crumbling as residents realized the true cost of their leaders' arrogance. Neighbors demanded answers, apologies, and resignations at the town hall meetings, which became increasingly tense. Some Willow Creek residents, ashamed of what had been done in their name, came to the Jefferson Farm to apologize in person, offering help and pledging to vote for new leadership. Others stuck to Margaret's words, insisting that the airstrip would have brought prosperity and pointing the finger at Harold for dividing the community. Through it all, Harold remained steady, refusing to be drawn into personal attacks or public feuds. He reiterated the same point throughout his appearances at community forums, on local radio, and even on national television. This land is more than just soil and crops. It is both our past and our future, and it serves as a reminder that no one is above the law. His words resonated far beyond Willow Creek, inspiring similar fights in towns across the country. The legal case finally came to trial in a packed county courthouse, the air thick with anticipation. Harold's lawyers presented a mountain of evidence, land deeds, correspondence, expert testimony, and the damning findings of the FAA and federal investigators. Margaret took the stand, her confidence visibly shaken, and under cross-examination, she was forced to admit that she had never actually spoken to Harold, never visited the farm, and had relied entirely on the advice of her legal team and a handful of influential residents. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a unanimous verdict in favor of the Jeffersons. The HOA was ordered to pay full restitution for damage to the farm, to fund the restoration of the land, and to issue a public apology. County officials faced criminal charges, and the Willow Creek HOA was placed under state oversight pending a complete overhaul of its leadership and practices. The victory was total, but for Harold, it was bittersweet. The land would not completely recover, and emotional and physical scars would not disappear overnight. But as he stood in the field with his family, watching the first new shoots of corn break through the soil, he felt a deep sense of peace. The farm would continue to exist, the law would prevail, and the legacy of Jefferson would endure. In the months that followed the verdict, the Jefferson Farm became a symbol of resilience and justice, drawing visitors from across the state and beyond. Students on field trips, journalists seeking follow-up stories, and families who simply wanted to shake Harold's hand and thank him for standing up when so many would have given in. The land, though still scarred in places, began to heal under the careful stewardship of Harold and his family, who worked from dawn to dusk replanting, repairing, and restoring what had been lost. The community, too, was transformed. With a new board of residents who understood the true meaning of stewardship and service, the Willow Creek HOA, once a bastion of unchecked authority, was now a model of transparency and accountability. Margaret Langley, disgraced and facing her own legal troubles, quietly moved away, her name now a cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood gatherings. The county, eager to make amends, partnered with local organizations to fund environmental restoration projects, planting trees and wildflowers along the edges of the new fields, and establishing a scholarship in the Jefferson family's name for students pursuing careers in agriculture and environmental science. Harold, ever humble, declined most invitations to speak at conferences or appear on television, preferring the quiet satisfaction of a day's work and the laughter of his grandchildren running through the rows of corn. He did, however, consent to one interview, speaking steadily as he reflected on the ordeal while sitting on his porch as the sun set over fields. He explained, "We didn't ask for this fight, but sometimes you don't get to choose your battles. You just have to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." His words were heard by viewers all over the country, and they sparked a new discussion about the value of knowing the law, community power, and land rights. The farm's recovery was slow, but steady. With the restitution funds, Harold invested in new equipment, upgraded irrigation systems, and brought in experts to help restore the soil. The first full harvest after the trial was smaller than usual, but it was celebrated as a triumph. Neighbors gathering for a potluck in the barn, sharing food, music, and stories late into the night. The sense of community that had been fractured by the Runway debacle was now stronger than ever, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the lessons learned. During the summer camps, children from Willow Creek and beyond visited the farm to learn about sustainable agriculture, the history of black farmers in the United States, and the significance of standing up for one's beliefs. Inspired by their grandfather's example, Harold's grandchildren began to dream of their own land-based futures and were eager to add their own chapters to the Jefferson narrative. As the seasons turned and the fields flourished once more, Harold found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The battles fought, the friendships forged, the land reclaimed. He had the quiet confidence of a man who had survived the worst and emerged stronger, despite the fact that he was aware that there would always be new difficulties and storms to weather. The farm was more than just a place. It was a legacy, a promise, and a beacon for all who believed in justice, community, and the enduring power of the land. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of corn, Harold Jefferson stood at the edge of his fields, his heart full of gratitude and hope, knowing that the fight for what's right is never truly over, but that, with faith and perseverance, it can always be won.